There's something different about people who grew up before the internet. Not just older, not just more nostalgic, different in the way they move through the world, different in the way they wait, the way they listen, the way they handle silence, because they were shaped in a reality that moved slower, felt heavier, and demanded more from the mind when no screen was there to catch it. And today, in a world of constant updates, instant answers, and endless noise, that older wiring still hasn't disappeared. Let's start with something most people overlook. People who grew up before the internet didn't just live without technology. They lived without constant interruption. Their attention developed in longer stretches. You could sit in one room for an hour with a book, a magazine, a toy, a thought, or just the sound of a fan humming in the background. There was no notification pulling at your mind every 3 minutes, no tabs open, no algorithm feeding you the next thing before you had fully finished the first. So your brain learned something that now feels almost rare. It learned how to stay with something, a thought, a task, a feeling, a conversation. That kind of attention wasn't trained through discipline. It was simply the default environment. And when you spend years in that environment, your inner world becomes deeper, steadier, and harder to distract. Now, think about what communication felt like back then. If you wanted to talk to someone, you had to call the house. Not the person, the house. Someone else might answer. A parent, a sibling. Maybe nobody answered at all. Maybe you just had to try again later. There was friction in every interaction, and that friction changed people. It made communication feel more intentional. You didn't message 10 people at once while half paying attention. You called one person, you waited, you spoke, you listened. And because communication was slower, relationships often had more weight to them. Words weren't thrown around every second of the day. Silence existed between people, and that silence wasn't always a problem. It was just part of life. Today, many people feel anxious if a message sits unanswered for an hour. But those who grew up before the internet were shaped in a world where delay was normal. You could go all day, all weekend, sometimes longer, without instant contact. And it didn't mean rejection. It just meant life was happening somewhere else. That's another thing modern life often misunderstands. People from the pre-internet world developed a completely different relationship with time. Today, time feels chopped into tiny digital fragments. A scroll, a swipe, a refresh, a quick check that becomes 20 minutes. But before the internet, time felt larger, more physical, more continuous. You felt an afternoon. You didn't just consume it. Waiting was built into everything. Waiting for a TV show to come on, waiting for photos to be developed, waiting for a letter, waiting to hear back, waiting for stores to open, waiting because that was simply how reality worked. And slowly that waiting did something to the mind. It taught patience not as a virtue, but as a normal state of existence. It taught people how to live with incomplete information, how to not know yet, how to let things unfold at their natural pace instead of demanding immediate closure. Now imagine boredom in that world. Real boredom. Not the modern version where someone says they're bored while holding a device that can access millions of videos, songs, conversations, and distractions. We're talking about the kind of boredom that fills a room when there is truly nothing planned, nothing incoming, and nothing pressing a button for you. You sat in it. You stared out the window. You paced around the house. You flipped through the same magazine again. You lay on the floor and let your mind wander. And after a while, something happened. Your brain started generating its own material, an idea, a game, a memory, a question, a strange plan. Pre-internet childhood gave people repeated exposure to understimulation, and that forced the mind to become creative from the inside out. They didn't always need external stimulation because they had practice making something from mental emptiness. And that matters more than it sounds, because many adults today feel uncomfortable the second nothing is happening. But people who grew up before the internet often learned that emptiness is not an emergency. It's the beginning of thought. Then there's the matter of being alone. Before digital life, being alone actually meant being alone. No group chat lighting up. No short-form videos filling every quiet second. No invisible crowd sitting in your pocket. If you were in your room, you were in your room. If you were walking somewhere alone, you were just walking, with your own thoughts for company. And that did something profound. It trained people to build an internal relationship with themselves. They learned how their minds sounded without constant outside input. They learned how to think privately, not performatively. They learned that solitude and loneliness were not the same thing. In fact, many people who grew up before the internet still carry that distinction inside them. They can spend time alone without immediately feeling abandoned by the world. They don't always need to broadcast what they're doing to feel that it happened. Their sense of self was formed in private spaces, not in front of an audience. And maybe that's one of the biggest psychological differences of all. People who grew up before the internet were not constantly mirrored back to themselves. Today, identity is often shaped in real time through reaction, likes, views, comments, shares, validation loops. People can start seeing themselves through the eyes of an invisible crowd before they've fully figured out who they are alone. But in the pre-internet world, much of identity developed more quietly. You tried things without documenting them. You failed without public evidence. You changed without announcing it. You could have awkward phases, bad opinions, strange experiments, and moments of confusion that simply disappeared into time. There was freedom in that invisibility. A person could evolve without feeling watched. And because of that, many who grew up before the internet still value authenticity in a way that feels different, not because they're morally superior, but because their identity was formed before self-presentation became a daily habit. Now, let's talk about memory. Before the internet, you couldn't instantly search for everything. If you wanted to remember a phone number, you remembered it. If you wanted directions, you held them in your head or wrote them down. If you wanted a fact, you either knew it, asked someone, or went looking for it in a slower, more physical way. That doesn't just affect convenience, it affects the mind itself. People from that era often built stronger habits of mental retrieval because memory had to do more work. Their brains were used not only to accessing information, but to carrying it. And there's a subtle emotional effect that comes with that too. The world felt less externally stored. More of life lived inside you. A song lyric, a family phone number, a route through town, a birthday, a story someone told you once. You kept pieces of reality in your head because there was nowhere else to instantly place them. That kind of memory creates a different feeling of ownership over your life. And then there is the texture of everyday experience. Before the internet, reality had more edges. You got lost. You misheard things. You had incomplete plans. You knocked on doors. You showed up and hoped. You spent time not knowing. And while that uncertainty could be inconvenient, it also made life feel more tangible, more embodied, more real. Today, so much friction has been removed that people can move through entire days without fully encountering the world in a direct way. But those who grew up before the internet were trained by physical reality. They had to read maps, read rooms, read tone, read faces. They had to tolerate ambiguity without instantly resolving it through search. That built a kind of psychological endurance. The ability to stay functional even when information is missing. The ability to operate without immediate clarity. The ability to trust judgment instead of outsourcing every decision. You can see this especially clearly in how they relate to attention and presence. Many pre-internet adults still notice when modern conversations fracture too quickly. One person speaks while another glances at a phone. A story starts, but a notification cuts it in half. A quiet evening becomes background noise for scrolling, and something in them resists that, because they remember another rhythm, a slower rhythm, one where dinner conversations lasted longer, one where watching a film actually meant watching a film, one where music played and people just listened, one where a person sitting alone on a bench was simply sitting alone on a bench, not waiting to be digitally rescued from the moment. They come from a world where presence was less interrupted. And because of that, modern life can feel strangely thin to them. Fast, connected, efficient, and somehow still thin. But this doesn't mean life before the internet was perfect. It wasn't. It could be boring, isolating, inconvenient, and sometimes painfully slow. Information was harder to access. Mistakes took longer to fix. Distance felt more final. But that older world gave people something that is becoming harder to develop now. A stronger tolerance for slowness. A stronger tolerance for silence. A stronger tolerance for their own mind. And those capacities shape everything. They affect how a person loves, how they grieve, how they work, how they rest, how they argue, how they wait, how they recover when life becomes uncertain. Because when you grow up in a world that doesn't instantly respond to your impulses, you adapt differently. You become less dependent on immediate feedback, less shocked by delay, less desperate to fill every empty second. You learn that attention can stretch, that loneliness doesn't have to be solved instantly, that meaning doesn't always arrive in a notification. And even if those people fully use smartphones, streaming services, social media, and modern technology now, part of them still remembers another operating system, one built in living rooms, libraries, sidewalks, schoolyards, long car rides, quiet bedrooms, and evenings that passed without being recorded. That's why people who grew up before the internet can feel different today. Not because they're frozen in the past, not because they reject the present, but because their minds were formed before reality became permanently connected, permanently accelerated, and permanently available. They were shaped in a quieter world, a slower world, a world where attention had depth, boredom had purpose, solitude had meaning, and time was allowed to feel like time. And once a person is built in that kind of world, some part of them never fully stops measuring life against it, even now, even here, in all this noise.